The worn rubber soles of her sensible shoes made a desperate, squeaking sound on the polished marble floor. Each step echoed in the cavernous silence of the lobby, a cathedral built to money she could barely comprehend. Isabella Rossi clutched the single folded page of her resume, the paper already damp in her palm. This was Moretti Tech, a name that gleamed from the top of the city's newest glass and steel spire. It was a long shot, but the pay for the janitorial position was triple what she'd made at her last job. She thought this was about survival, a chance to finally get ahead of the bills that piled up like snowdrifts against her apartment door. However, when the elevator doors opened directly into a penthouse office with a view of the entire city, the man waiting for her was not a facilities manager. He was Dante Moretti. He sat behind a desk of dark, unadorned wood, the kind that cost more than her car. The world she was actually in had nothing to do with mops and buckets. And now, as his cool, dark eyes settled on her, she had the distinct feeling she would not be allowed to leave. He gestured to the chair opposite him, a fluid, economical movement of one hand. Isabella sat, her back straight, the cheap fabric of her interview blouse suddenly feeling flimsy and foolish. She placed her resume on the vast expanse of the desk. He did not look at it. His focus was entirely on her, a gaze so intense it felt like a physical weight. Isabella Rossi, he said. Her name sounded different in his mouth. Not a question, but a confirmation of a long-held fact. She swallowed. Yes, sir. I'm here about the custodial position. A flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, though it held no warmth, crossed his features before vanishing. I'm aware. He finally picked up the resume, though his eyes remained on her face. He held it by a corner, as if the paper itself were beneath him. For a long minute, the only sound was the whisper of the building's climate control system. She could feel a bead of sweat tracing a path down her spine. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. A man like Dante Moretti, a titan of the tech industry whose face was occasionally plastered on business magazines, did not personally interview the night shift cleaning staff. His gaze dropped to the page. His thumb brushed over her last name, a small, deliberate gesture. Rossi, he repeated, the name a low rumble in the quiet room. Your father was Marco Rossi. The question hit her like a punch to the gut. Her father had been dead for 6 years. A heart attack on the docks, they'd said. He was a union man, a stevedore his whole life, a world away from this palace in the clouds. Yes, she managed, her voice tight. He was. Dante set the paper down, aligning it perfectly with the edge of his desk. He was a man who made promises he could not keep. Isabella's confusion curdled into a cold dread. I don't understand. My father has nothing to do with my application. On the contrary, Dante said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming something that coiled in the air between them. He has everything to do with it. He leaned forward, the expensive wool of his suit jacket not making a single sound. 6 years ago, your father took something that belonged to my family. Not money, something far more valuable. Information. He sold it. The man he sold it to is dead. The men who paid for it are dead. But the debt remains. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. Debt? What debt? We had nothing. He had nothing. He had his daughter, Dante said simply. The words hung in the air, monstrous and undeniable. This wasn't an interview. It was a reckoning. She had walked in here looking for a job and had walked into a cage she hadn't even seen being built. She was the collateral for a ghost sin. You can't, she whispered, the words barely audible. I can. He slid a different document across the desk. It was thick, bound in a simple black cover. An employment contract. Your application is accepted, Miss Rossi. You'll be cleaning my private offices and penthouse residence. Exclusively. The salary listed on the advertisement will be deposited into your account weekly. The terms of your employment, however, are detailed in here. His eyes were like chips of obsidian. They are non-negotiable. You will sign it and you will begin tonight. Refusal is not an option. She stared at the contract, then back at his impassive face. She had thought she was at the bottom. She had been wrong. The floor had just dropped out, revealing a darkness she never knew existed. She had come here seeking a lifeline, but what he offered was an anchor, ready to drag her down into his world. And as she looked into the unyielding certainty of his eyes, she knew without a doubt that she was already sunk. Her first shift began at 10 o'clock that night. A silent man with a scar that cut through his left eyebrow led her up in the private elevator, the one that required a keycard and a thumbprint. He handed her a gray uniform, a keycard of her own, and a rolling cart stocked with supplies that looked like they belonged in a laboratory, not a janitor's closet. The instructions were simple. She was to clean Dante Moretti's office, his private kitchen, his meeting rooms, and the attached penthouse residence on the floor above. She was not to speak to anyone unless spoken to. She was not to touch anything on his desk. She was to be invisible. The penthouse was a testament to cold, hard minimalism. Black leather, chrome, and glass stretched across vast, empty-feeling spaces. It wasn't a home. It was a showroom for a man who had no need for comfort. It was also immaculate. There was nothing to clean. The floors shone, the surfaces were dustless. Her job, she quickly realized, was not about sanitation. It was about presence. It was about being there, a piece of his property, working off a debt she didn't understand in a gilded cage. He was often there. He would sit at his massive desk, the city lights a glittering tapestry behind him, and work. He never acknowledged her beyond a curt nod when she entered. She would move around the periphery of the enormous office, wiping down already clean surfaces, emptying a wastebasket that contained only a single crumpled piece of paper, the scent of his cologne, sandalwood and something sharp, like cedar, a constant presence in the air. She learned to read the silence. The nights he was tense, the silence was sharp, brittle. The nights he was satisfied, it was heavy, like a blanket. She overheard things, fragments of conversations from men who came and went, men who moved with the quiet lethality of predators. They spoke of territories, tribute, and loyalty. They never spoke of tech startups. Moretti Tech was a phantom, a legitimate face for a body of pure shadow. And she was a ghost haunting its halls. Her body, which had always been a source of quiet shame for her, felt clumsy and loud in these sterile spaces. She was soft and round in a world of hard edges and sharp angles. She caught her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows, a thick-waisted woman in a dull gray uniform against a backdrop of infinite, sparkling lights. She expected dismissal in the eyes of the men who saw her, the same casual cruelty she'd endured her whole life. But from Dante she got nothing. He looked at her, and his gaze was not disdainful. It was appraising, as if he were cataloging her, learning the way she moved, the way she carried her own weight. It was more unnerving than any insult. One night, weeks into her strange servitude, she found him not at his desk, but standing by the window, looking out at the city. A glass of amber liquid was untouched on a nearby table. The tension in the room was different tonight. It wasn't anger. It was grief, a raw, palpable sorrow that seemed to suck the air out of the vast space. She hesitated at the door, her cart a clumsy shield. She should have turned around, left him to his solitude. But she was frozen. He didn't turn, but he spoke, his voice quiet. Come in. She pushed her cart into the room, the squeak of the wheels and obscenity in the stillness. She began her pointless routine, polishing a chrome table leg, her eyes fixed on her work. She could feel his gaze on her, but he remained at the window. On his desk, propped against a pen holder, was a framed photograph she had never seen before. It was of a younger Dante, smiling a real, unguarded smile, with his arm around an older man who shared his dark eyes and strong jaw. "My brother," Dante said, his voice rough. He had turned from the window and was now looking at the photograph. "Lorenzo." Isabella stopped her polishing, her hands still on the cloth. "He was supposed to take over from our father," Dante continued, his voice devoid of emotion, a recitation of facts. He was better with people. He trusted them. I told him it was a weakness. He picked up the photograph, his thumb stroking the glass over his brother's face. A man he brought in, a man he vouched for, betrayed him, set him up for a rival. I was supposed to be watching his back. I was too late. He put the photograph down, his back to her once more. The confession, stark and unadorned, hung in the air. It was the first piece of himself he had ever shown her. The source of the coldness, the wound he carried. He had failed to protect the one person he was meant to, and he had rebuilt himself into a fortress so it would never happen again. The next evening, as she was restocking the small kitchen, one of his capos, a man named Rico with slicked-back hair and cruel eyes, cornered her by the refrigerator. "You know, for a big girl you move quiet," he said, a greasy smile spreading across his face as he blocked her path. The boss got a thing for cushions. Isabella's blood ran cold. She tried to step around him, but he shifted, blocking her again. "Excuse me," she said, her voice firm, betraying none of the fear churning in her stomach. "I'm just saying," Rico went on, his eyes roaming over her body in a way that made her skin crawl. A lot to hold on to. Before he could say another word, Dante's voice sliced through the air from the office doorway. "Rico." It was just one word, spoken without volume, yet it cracked like a whip. Rico froze, the smirk wiped clean from his face. He turned, his posture immediately deferential. "Boss, just talking to the help." Dante didn't move from the doorway. He just looked at Rico, a long, silent look that was more menacing than any threat. "My help," he said, the words spaced for emphasis. "On my floor. You have business with me, not with her. Get out." Rico's face paled. He shot Isabella a look of pure venom before scurrying out of the kitchen and past Dante. Dante's eyes followed him until he was gone. He didn't look at Isabella. He didn't offer a word of comfort or ask if she was okay. He simply turned and walked back to his desk. "Finish your work," he said over his shoulder. But the act was louder than any words. It wasn't kindness. It was possession. A warning to his world that she was his. To be touched, to be spoken to be looked at only with his permission. It was terrifying. But as she stood there, her heart still pounding, a strange and dangerous warmth spread through her chest. In his own brutal way, he had protected her. And because of that, later, when she was cleaning one of the meeting rooms after Rico and his men had left, she noticed something on the floor. It was a tiny USB drive, no bigger than her thumbnail, half hidden under the leg of the chair Rico always sat in. Her protocol was to turn in any lost items to security. But she thought of Rico's sneer, and she thought of the cold fury in Dante's voice. She hesitated for only a second. Then, her hand moving with a will of its own, she picked up the drive and slipped it deep into the pocket of her uniform. Back in her small, cramped apartment, the city seemed a world away. Isabella sat at her rickety kitchen table, the tiny USB drive feeling heavy and dangerous in her palm. Plugging it into her old, slow laptop felt like crossing a line from which she could never return. Her hands trembled as the machine whirred and clicked. A single folder appeared on the screen. Inside were spreadsheets, shipping manifests, and scanned ledgers. It took her an hour to understand what she was looking at, but when she did, a cold certainty settled in her stomach. It was a shadow ledger. Rico was skimming, not just small amounts, but systematically redirecting a portion of the family's shipments, selling them to a rival, the Fabry family, and pocketing the profits. The data was meticulous, damning, and stretched back for over a year. She closed the laptop, her breath catching in her throat. This was a death sentence for Rico, but handing it over was a risk for her, too. Dante was a man who valued control and information above all else. Finding out that his janitor had possessed this kind of leverage, even for a few hours, could be seen as a threat. He could decide she knew too much, that she was a liability. Yet not telling him was worse. Rico's betrayal was a cancer in his organization. If it was discovered by someone else, or if the Fabry family used it to weaken him, the fragile, terrifying protection he offered her would vanish. She made a choice. She would not just hand it over. She would wait. She would give it to him when he needed it most. It was a gamble, a desperate play in a game where she didn't even know all the rules. The next week, the tension in the penthouse thickened. Meetings ran late into the night. Voices were raised. A shipment had gone missing, a valuable one. Dante was a storm cloud of controlled fury, pacing his office like a caged panther. Isabella watched him from the periphery, her secret a lead weight in her gut. She saw the way he looked at his men, his eyes searching for the traitor he knew was among them. But his gaze always slid past Rico. Lorenzo's ghost still haunted him. He couldn't see the betrayal in someone he'd known for years, someone who had been loyal in the past. The danger finally spilled out of the penthouse and into the real world. As she was leaving the building one night, heading toward the employee parking garage, two black sedans screeched into the lane, boxing in the car of one of Dante's top men. Men with guns poured out. Isabella flattened herself behind a concrete pillar, her heart seizing in her chest. The shootout was fast and brutal. The sound of gunfire was deafening in the enclosed space. Just as she thought she was hidden, a man from one of the sedans spotted her. He raised his weapon. Time seemed to slow down. She saw the dark hole of the barrel, the flash of his teeth in a cruel grin. Suddenly, an arm like a steel band wrapped around her waist, yanking her back. She slammed into a hard body, the scent of sandalwood and gunpowder overwhelming her. It was Dante. He shoved her behind him, using his own body as a shield as he fired two precise shots. The man who had been aiming at her crumpled to the ground. The fight was over in seconds. Dante's men were ruthlessly efficient. He didn't release her right away. He stood there, his back to her, his chest rising and falling in the aftermath. She was pressed against him, her cheek against the fine wool of his suit, her hands flat against the hard muscle of his back. She could feel the heat of him, the coiled power. The raw, terrifying reality of who he was and what he did was no longer an abstract concept. It was here, solid and lethal against her. Finally, he stepped away, turning to face her. His face was a mask of cold fury, but his eyes, when they met hers, held a different fire. Adrenaline sang through her veins. This was it. This was the moment. Back in the silent tomb of his office, he poured 2 glasses of whiskey. He handed one to her. Her hand was shaking so badly she had to use both to hold it steady. He watched her, his expression unreadable. "They're getting bold," he said, his voice a low growl. This was a message. Isabella took a sip of the whiskey. It burned a welcome path down her throat. She set the glass down on the desk, the soft click loud in the silence. Then she reached into her pocket, pulled out the small USB drive, and placed it on the polished wood between them. She said nothing. She just met his gaze. He looked from the drive to her face, his eyes narrowing. He picked it up, turning it over in his fingers. He knew. He knew what it was and what it meant that she was the one giving it to him. "You should have given this to me the moment you found it," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. She found her own voice, surprised by its steadiness. "You weren't ready to see it." The truth of her words hung between them. He had been blinded by the past, by his brother's ghost. He had been looking for a complicated betrayal, a master plan from his enemies. He hadn't been looking at the simple, greedy rot right under his nose. He stared at her for a long time, the silence stretching until it was a tangible thing. He was seeing her, she realized, for the first time, not as the janitor, not as Marco Rossi's daughter. He was seeing her as an asset, player, someone who understood. That silent, shared understanding was more intimate than any touch, more binding than any confession of affection. It was a confession of a different sort, a recognition of equals in a world where such a thing was impossible. He slid the drive into his laptop. He didn't need to look at it for long. A muscle feathered in his jaw. The cold fury returned to his eyes, but this time it was focused, precise, lethal. Rico disappeared the next day. There was no announcement, no discussion. One day he was there, and the next, his chair in the meeting room was empty. Life went on. But Isabella knew she had sealed a man's fate. The knowledge didn't sit easily, but neither did the thought of his betrayal going unpunished. She had crossed a line, done something morally gray to survive, to protect the fragile order she now inhabited. She thought proving her loyalty, proving her utility, would make her safer. She was wrong. Her action had a consequence she never anticipated. The Fabry family knew their inside source had been cut off. They knew Dante had plugged the leak. And they knew who Rico, their source, had last been seen antagonizing. The insignificant, overlooked cleaning lady. They saw her not as a threat, but as a weakness, a soft target, a message waiting to be sent. By making herself valuable to Dante, she had made herself a primary target for his enemies. The kidnapping was quiet, brutally efficient, and utterly mundane. There were no screeching tires or gunfire. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, on the sidewalk outside her neighborhood grocery store. One moment she was fumbling for her keys, a bag of groceries cutting into her arm, and the next a black van pulled up to the curb. Two men got out. They didn't rush. They moved with a calm purpose that was more terrifying than any overt aggression. One took her keys, the other her arm. Before she could scream, a hand was clamped over her mouth and she was bundled into the back of the van. The man in charge introduced himself as Fabry. He was older, with silver hair and eyes the color of a winter sky. He didn't threaten her. He spoke to her as if explaining a simple business transaction. "You are leverage, Miss Rossi," he said, his voice calm. "Dante Moretti is a man who dislikes loose ends. He has made a mess, and you are part of it. He will trade a great deal to have you back, simply to clean the slate. Then he will dispose of you. You mean nothing to him beyond what you represent. A vulnerability." Isabella's mind raced, cutting through the panic. Fabry was wrong. He saw her as a pawn, a debtor's daughter Dante was saddled with. He didn't know about the USB drive. He didn't know she was the one who had exposed his mole. She had a sliver of knowledge, a sliver of power, and it was all she had. She remembered the nights spent emptying wastebaskets, piecing together shredded documents out of sheer, terrified curiosity. She remembered the names, the places, the whispers. "You think this is about him?" she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "You think you're the only one Rico was talking to?" She looked past Fabry, to the hulking man sitting beside him, his underboss. "Ask your man, Silvio, about the meetings he's been taking with the Byrne family. Ask him about the port contracts he's been promising them." It was a calculated shot in the dark, a truth stitched together from fragments and guesswork. But it landed. Fabry's head snapped toward his underboss. Silvio's face went rigid, a flicker of panic in his eyes before he could mask it. The seed of doubt was planted. In their world, doubt was a poison that worked faster than any bullet. She had just turned their greatest strength, their rigid hierarchy of trust, into a weapon against them. She had bought herself time. The meeting was set for a deserted warehouse by the river. She was the price of admission. When Dante arrived, he was alone, just as they demanded. He walked into the vast, echoing space, his hands empty, his face carved from stone. Fabry smiled, triumphant. "You see? He comes for his property." But Isabella saw the look in Dante's eyes. This was not a negotiation. It was an execution, and her words had already set the stage. Fabry's men were restless, their eyes shifting between Dante, their boss, and Silvio. The unified front was broken. "Let her go, Fabry," Dante said, his voice deceptively calm. "First, we discuss terms." Fabry began, but the hesitation in his own ranks was palpable. That was all Dante needed. He moved. It was a blur of motion, a symphony of violence. And he was not alone. From the shadows, his men emerged, silent and lethal. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Fabry, realizing he'd been played from the inside and out, turned his gun on Isabella. But Silvio, seeing his own chance, was faster. He shot his own boss in the back. The fight was over almost as soon as it began. Dante came to her, his movements swift. He cut the ties on her wrists, his hands surprisingly gentle. He scanned her for injuries, his jaw tight with a fury that was terrifying in its intensity. He wasn't looking at a rescued damsel. He was looking at a survivor, a partner who had held the line. The aftermath was costly. Men were lost. Blood was paid. But the Fabry organization was shattered, its leadership decapitated by their own ambition and her well-placed words. Later, back in the penthouse, the city lights below seemed distant, like fallen stars. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. Dante stood beside her at the window, the silence stretching between them. "My brother Lorenzo," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely showed. "He trusted the wrong people. He saw the good in them and it got him killed. I spent years making sure I would never make the same mistake." He turned to face her, his dark eyes searching hers. "I see what you are, Isabella. You don't see the good in people. You see the truth in them. You see the world for what it is." It was the highest compliment he could give. It was not a declaration of love. It was a declaration of respect, a recognition of a shared soul, forged in different fires but tempered to the same strength. He held out his hand, palm up. It was not a command. It was not a gesture of assistance. It was an offer. "The debt is paid," he said. "Marco Rossi's slate is clean. You can leave. You are free to go." She looked at his hand, at the long, capable fingers, the signet ring that gleamed in the low light. Then she looked at his face. She thought of her life before this, the quiet desperation, the invisibility, the feeling of being perpetually overlooked. Here, in this violent, shadow-drenched world, she had been seen. This man, who saw everything as a transaction, a weakness or a weapon, had looked at her and seen a queen. Freedom was a cold, empty apartment and a life of being invisible again. This was a cage, yes, but it was also a throne. It was a choice she never thought she would have. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her hand and placed it in his. His fingers closed around hers, a firm, possessive warmth. The contact was an answer, a contract, a vow. It was a choice made with eyes wide open. In the heart of the darkness, she was finally ready to call home.